Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for In Search of Shalom, Race Justice, and Mass Incarceration. We are glad that you are spending your Sunday evening with us. This is a monthly gathering in which we discuss race and justice in today's world and discover the important role each of us plays in seeking justice and restoring shalom. This series is jointly sponsored by the Black Scholars and Professionals Unit and the Pacific Area region of InterVarsity's graduate and faculty ministry. My name is Star, and I'm one of the volunteer organizers. I am from East St. Louis, Illinois, and I'm graduating from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with a master's in food science and human nutrition. I'm hoping that we can learn more about how we can welcome returning citizens back into society. To start the night's proceedings, I'll ask Reverend Tim Singh to open us up in prayer.
Thank you, Star. Hello, everyone. Let us give our hearts and our minds to the Lord as we invite him into our presence now. Gracious God, we are so thankful for your goodness, your graciousness, and your holiness. You look upon our world of this suffering, and I am so sure that your heart is broken to see the pain that your children are experiencing today, whether it's through the pandemic or through massive injustice in our structures in our society. Lord, your heart must be broken. And so we invite you here and ask you to just be with us, to be present here as we reflect and think and just look to you for wisdom to address all the pain in our society and in our world. Be with our speakers. May what they share open our hearts, our minds, our eyes, and yes, Lord, even move us so that we can do what we can with what you've given to us to make a difference for your gospel, for your world. Thank you, God. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for all that you've done for us. And I pray that you just continue to preside and watch and lead us this evening and in the days ahead, especially as we look to welcoming and celebrating your birth. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tim. So you might be wondering why we included mass incarceration in our discussion series on race and justice and how mass incarceration is connected to shalom. Shalom is the forceful goodness of all the world's relationships among humans and God, humans and themselves, and humans and the environment. Justice is the act of pursuing shalom. It is the thrust to maintain the goodness of the world's relationships and to repair them when breached. A true justice system should recognize the image of God within each person and strive for their right to relationship with self and others. However, the American criminal justice system prioritizes revenge over redemption, locking almost 1% of its population away from the society and denying them the opportunity to restore the right standing. Tonight, we will investigate the issue of mass incarceration, ask what the role the church has played in the phenomenon, and discern how God asks us to seek justice and restore shalom. My fellow organizers and I will provide a summary of the resources we recommended on our series reading list. Then we will hear from Mr. Dominique Gilliard about his book, Rethinking Incarceration, Advocating for Justice That Restores, in conversation with our guests, Amaya Cook, Joseph Soros, and Jerron Hawkins. In the end, we'll come back together with our own questions and then break out into discuss the issue in smaller groups. So first, I'm going to start with the article with Lorna Collier's feature article, Incarceration Nation, published by the American Psychological Association. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, leading even China and possibly North Korea. The United States prison population began increasing in the late 1960s and early 1970s due to increased drug penalties for drugs like crack cocaine, a move to mandatory and policies that ensure prisoners served at least 85% of their sentences. The policies increased the numbers of people in jails and prisons. Coupled with systematic racial differences in case processing, they largely filled them with poor, uneducated people of color. In the 1960s, many health treatment centers also shut down, and because there were few community resources to help them, the mentally ill began going to jails instead. Today, about half of all prison inmates report mental health concerns. Once in prison, overcrowding can worsen inmates' health outcomes and increase the risk of suicide. Some organizations recommend that policymakers revise criminal justice policies and support prisoners so that they won't reoffend by paying attention to social and economic conditions.
Thank you, Star. My name is Ray Michelle, and I was raised in both Virginia and Trinidad and Tobago. After graduating from the College of William and Mary, I moved to New York City, where I now reside. The United States is a nation that claims to be under God, but many of the principles espoused by the Bible, grace, mercy, love, and ultimate redemption, are not always reflected in our criminal justice system. This month, I read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which argues that mass incarceration is the newest expression of racial disenfranchisement in the United States. In the 1600s, a racial caste system was invented to justify slavery and Native American genocide. Consequently, the myth of white supremacy has influenced law in the United States from its inception, coloring the language of the Constitution and impacting access to land ownership, education, and the electoral process to this day. After the Reconstruction period ended, Southern politicians introduced Jim Crow laws to hinder Black social mobility. In the 1950s, the term law and order was used to oppose the civil rights movement. By the 1980s, the idea of law and order buttressed the war on drugs, but was completely sanitized of its racial tones. Despite the fact that drug use is uniform across all groups, Black and brown people are more heavily targeted by police. Sometimes unable to afford attorneys, these defendants are assigned overworked and underpaid public defendants, resulting in a higher number of guilty pleas. Mandatory minimum sentences guarantee them long jail times. Upon release, state laws often bar former prisoners from public housing, voting, health and welfare benefits, and employment and education assistance. Returning citizens are not protected by law from discrimination from employers or landlords. Much like Jim Crow, this has created a cycle of poverty, marginalization, and disenfranchisement that mainly affects Black and brown Americans. Colorblindness in police departments, courtrooms, juries, and American society at large allows this to go unchecked. Alexander challenges us to look beyond ending mass incarceration. Just as slavery gave way to Jim Crow, which gave way to mass incarceration, a new means of subjugation would rise from the ashes. She suggests shifting to a revolutionary ideology that challenges the structure of society, supports human dignity, demolishes the racial caste system, and, this is my own insertion, upholds the forceful goodness of relationships between human beings. True shalom.
Thanks for sharing, Ray Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Gloria Darko, and I'm from the Bronx, New York. I'm an alumna of Susquehanna University, and I currently work there as an admission counselor. I'm very interested in law, government, and other political issues, which is why I studied international studies in college. However, in recent years, I have found that a topic that I haven't been very knowledgeable about is the American prison system. Last year, I was scrolling through my Twitter feed when I noticed a tweet encouraging everyone to watch a documentary on Netflix titled 13th. So I did. In 13th, filmmaker Ava DuVernay explores the intersection of race, justice, and mass incarceration in the United States. She argues that the modern-day prison system is an extension of slavery. The film is titled after the 13th Amendment, which states that there should not be slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. The film sheds light on the dehumanization of America's Black population, particularly Black men, who are disproportionately imprisoned at a higher rate than other Americans. Black men are 6.5% of the United States population, but 40.4% 2% of the prison population. 13th is a documentary that opened my eyes to a reality that I wasn't aware of. One of the striking statistics in the film is that the United States is 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's prisoners. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. So much for the land of the free. The film focuses on the fact that even though the 13th Amendment legally abolished slavery, the clause within it is a loophole that has allowed America to take advantage of African Americans, having them perform free labor, which benefits corporations. The film states that the American media has continually portrayed African Americans as criminals, which has led many to believe that Black people are more likely to become rapists, drug addicts, murderers, or thieves, simply because of the color of their skin. The film also sheds light on the effect of different presidencies on criminalization. I became more knowledgeable about terms such as the 1994 Federal Crime Bill, the war on drugs, and the crack cocaine epidemic. I had heard those terms before, but didn't really know what they meant. An additional statistic I learned about is that approximately 1 in 4 Black men will end up in a criminal justice system in their lifetime, and this is an alarming statistic that must change. This film has left many with some questions such as, why are we accepting a modern day form of slavery, and how do we break the cycle of mass incarceration? I agree with Van Jones' statement that our justice system is a human rights catastrophe and one of the biggest moral crises of our time.
Thank you, Gloria. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Samuel. I live in Rochester, New York, but I am from Trinidad and Tobago, where more than half of our incarcerated population has not even had their trial. Criminal injustice happens everywhere, and I am eager to discern how Christians everywhere are called to act in response. Today, we get to learn about mass incarceration from those working and studying the issue. I get to usher us into our posts as flies on the wall of what will be a riveting conversation on the issue, and then we, the audience, will get to join by asking our questions in the chat towards the end of the conversation. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Dominique Gilliard, author of Rethinking Incarceration, Advocating for Justice That Restores, along with 3 scholar activists, Amaya Cook, Joseph Sorrells, and Jaron Hawkins. Amaya Cook is currently pursuing a Master of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School. Following the womanist tradition, she focuses on early Christianity and how the early church upholds modern forms of abolition, justice, and equity, as well as the intersections of theory, religion, and social justice. Jaron Hawkins is a 2L at Howard University School of Law. He has worked as a member of ACLU's Education Equity Team and the Liberty Hill Foundation's Youth Justice Team. He is the founder of the REACH Foundation, an original member of My Brother's Keeper Alliance, and was a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Emerging Leaders Scholar. Joseph Dwayne Sorrells is a second-year MDiv student at Howard University School of Divinity. He serves as the Youth and Young Adult Director at Faith United Methodist Church in Rockville, Maryland, and has worked with many organizations that serve urban communities in need, promote advocacy for social justice, and civil rights for African Americans and other marginalized communities. And last but not least, Dominique Gilliard has served in pastoral ministry in Atlanta, Chicago, and Oakland. He holds 2 BAs in African American Studies and History from Georgia State University and a master's degree in history from East Tennessee State University with an emphasis on race, gender, and class in the United States. He also earned an MDiv from North Park Theological Seminary, where he served as an adjunct professor teaching Christian ethics, theology, and reconciliation. His book, Rethinking Incarceration, Advocating for Justice That Restores, addresses many of the shortcomings within the United States justice system and encourages Christians to pursue reforms that emphasize reconciliation rather than punishment. So Amaya, Joseph, Jaron, and Mr. Gilliard, we thank you for joining us today. Reverend Gilliard, we are ready to start off by hearing from you, and then we let our student panelists take over the conversation whenever you're ready.
Good evening. Excited to be with you tonight as we talk about a critically important issue. And as we talk about it, One of the things that I think we get wrong a lot of times when we think about this conversation and the church is that I think sometimes we think about the Bible as an ancient book that has no relevance for our day and time. But when we actually press into this conversation, we see explicitly how relevant scripture is for us in regards to how do we navigate the complexities of living in a society with a broken, or should I say, a biased criminal justice system. And so when we think about this, conversation for Christians really is fundamentally different than the rest of the world. So the conversation for the body of Christ starts in Romans 5:8, where we are told that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It wasn't once we were nice and neat and clean and put together. It was while we were still violators in need of grace that Jesus enters in on our behalf. Then Romans 8:38 tells us that nothing that we can do can separate us from the love of God. So before the pandemic, when we would gather in church on Sundays, we preach sermons, sing songs, pray prayers, thanking God that there's nothing that we can do that can separate us from the love of our Savior. But then we turn around and we live in a society where we just resuscitated the death penalty on the federal level, which ultimately says that certain people are beyond redemption, that there are certain violations that are so vile, all that we can do is put a person to death. That's antithetical to the good news of Jesus Christ. And so that's something that really is something more that's about our theology than our politics. When we keep pressing into scripture, Matthew 25 is one of the verses that's most explicit about our relationship to the criminal justice system. It says that if we are a follower of Jesus, we are supposed to be present with our brothers and sisters, communing with them behind bars. There are no exceptions. There are no kind of prefaces for that commandment. It says if you're a follower of Jesus, that's where you're supposed to be. In Hebrews 13:3, we're told to continue to remember those who are in prison as if we were there with them, suffering alongside of them. So in a nation that has more people who are incarcerated than any country in the history of the world, could you imagine the witness of the church if we really remembered incarcerated people in this way? But then, even more than that, when we think about some of the complexities over the last, 6 years in particular around police brutality and racial profiling and these different things, I'm shocked by how few churches I actually hear actually preaching and teaching about Acts 16. Because Acts 16 is a passage that actually talks to us and it describes a criminal justice system that is more in love with profiteering than it is with justice. It describes Paul and Silas who endure what's akin to police brutality today. It describes a system where racial bias is so prevalent that Paul and Silas are falsely accused as being as Jews. And as soon as they're accused of being as Jews, the crowd starts to participate in flogging them, stripping them naked, and they're denied access to a trial. This is the kind of biases that were present in the criminal justice system in Rome, and scripture is explicit about it. And it even goes even further to the point that once the magistrates realize that Paul and Silas are actually Roman citizens, then they get concerned about their mistreatment and they want to release them and treat them fairly. But Paul rebukes the system and says, no, you shamed us publicly, you beat us publicly, you discriminated against us publicly. You're going to have to actually let us out in public where there's accountability so the whole society can see how corrupt this system is. And I think this becomes a profound example for us in the midst of some of our conversations today around how do we navigate racial privilege, what does it mean, what is privilege real, all these different conversations that we continue to have in a circular way. Scripture frankly speaks to that and gives us a blueprint for how do we start to navigate that as the people of God. And then Proverbs 31:8 and 9 is another really important passage. It tells us that we're supposed to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all the destitute, speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And this passage is really important because this is a letter from the king's mom to the king. And why would a king's mom write this letter to the king if it was not regular for criminal justice systems to be running amok and the poor to be disenfranchised and denied justice within the criminal justice system? So she's speaking correctively to him and saying, because of who and whose you are, you can't abide by the social status quo, but you actually have to govern the criminal justice system in your domain in a different way because you're a Christ follower. And I think this passage is really important for us because while I hate the line, give voice to the voiceless, because the reality is there are no voiceless people. They're just people that were trained to not affirm their voice. When we actually think about our criminal justice system, though, the reality is that there are people who are stripped of their political voice. There are people who don't have a chance to participate in the democratic process, and therefore they are voiceless politically. And so I think this passage is really a commission to the body of Christ that's directly connected to Matthew 25, because we don't just go into prisons and jails to preach the gospel. We also go to learn from our brothers and sisters who are enduring this dehumanizing system, because there's a community development proverb that says those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And so if our brothers and sisters who are enduring this system are closest to the solution, but they're politically muted, then when we commune with them, we get a chance to actually glean from their wisdom and go back outside and amplify it, so we can help other brothers and sisters to understand the reforms that are needed, the strategic things that we need to be about as the people of God as we try to hold a criminal justice system accountable. And we're talking about a criminal justice system that Brian Stevenson commonly says treats people better if they're poor and treats people better if they're rich and guilty than if they're poor and innocent. That it's wealth, not guilt, that informs culpability within our present system. And so that's what we're up against, and that's what Scripture calls us to be about as the people of God. Right now, when we think about our criminal justice system, we need to know that there are over 44,000 legal collateral consequences that a returning citizen faces as they try to re-enter into society. That's 44,000 ways that they can be legally discriminated upon because of their criminal record. And this is particularly true for brothers and sisters who are returning with a felony conviction. When we talk about our system, there are 5 ways that are particularly funneling our criminal justice system, funneling people into our criminal justice system. You have the war on drugs, which most people have heard about. You have the school to prison pipeline, which is also pretty familiar for most people. You have the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities, where there are now 44 states plus the District of Columbia who have more people with severely diagnosed mental health impairments who are incarcerated than who are receiving treatment in the state's largest facility, psychiatric facility. And then you have the privatization of prisons and how lucrative private prisons have become. And then lastly, you have a parallel war to the war on drugs that just hasn't been coined as such, and that is the war on immigration. So when we actually look at who is in our criminal justice system, when we turn on the nightly news, we will believe that is disproportionately people who have committed violent offenses, but that's not true. The statistics actually show us that the vast majority of people who are in our criminal justice system are there for nonviolent offenses. And there are people who have substance abuse addictions, mental health impairments, or people who are been incarcerated because they've been trying to immigrate to our country either to make a better life for their families or fleeing violence in their home or famine. And so we're talking about the least of these who are getting caught up within our criminal justice system, and then they're being dehumanized and exploited for their labor in what's become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so when we're talking about it, I think it's really important for us to know who particularly we're talking about and how we got to the place that we are right now. When we talk about our nation, we need to understand that 1 in 14 children has a parent that has been impacted by the criminal justice system. And that number is only exacerbated by race and poverty. So when we talk about children who are impoverished, the number is 1 in 8. And when we talk about Black children, we're talking about 1 in 9. We also need to understand that when we talk about our nation, we usually learn that we are a nation in which people are innocent until proven guilty. Well, that's not a true reality anymore because of the reality of cash bail. Many people have heard a conversation about cash bail and the movement to try to end cash bail nationwide. Well, this is a critically important conversation because we need to understand that right now, 75% of people in America's local jails are there not because they've been convicted of a crime, but they're there because they're too poor to afford their bail. That means we spend $4 billion annually. That's $40 million a year. No, sorry, $40 million a day incarcerating people who have not been convicted of a crime, but who just can't afford their bail. And so this means that cash bail becomes this lucrative industry where impoverished people are incarcerated not because they've been convicted of crime, but just because they're too poor to afford their bail. And the classic case with this would be the case of Khalif Browder, a name that most people are familiar with. And if you aren't, I highly encourage you to write that name down and look it up. And so as we think about solutions real quickly, there are a number of different things that we can do. I think the first solution is understanding the power of proximity and how things actually change when we are present with our brothers and sisters behind bars. We get new insights about the things that we should be doing and the ways in which we can strategically align movements to actually end this system. But then on top of that, one of the ways that most people don't realize that we should really be thinking about restoring our system is actually providing access to higher education behind bars. So that is the most cost-effective and the most efficient way to reduce recidivism. So it's been proven that for every dollar we invest in higher education behind bars, we return $5 on our investment. And it's also been proven to reduce recidivism significantly. And the other piece of the puzzle in regards to that is implementing restorative justice circles, processing circles, and processes within our carceral systems have been more likely to produce reconciliation between the offending party and the victim, and it's also been more likely to pursue to reduce recidivism and produce people who are able to get down to the core needs of what drove their incarceration and their offense versus just masking it and continuing to traumatize them by putting them in a dehumanizing system. So I'll stop there and open it up with my colleagues to join into conversation.
Thank you so much, Reverend Gilliard. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm excited. I know my colleagues are excited about the dialogue and conversation that we're going to have. Again, I am Joseph Dwayne Charles, a second year MDiv student at Howard School of Divinity, and my other colleagues are welcome to introduce themselves at this moment. We'll get straight into the conversation and discussion for the evening.
Hi, Reverend Gilliard. Thank you all for having us once again. Thank you for the amazing book. It was really insightful. I learned a lot about, law and politics, even as a law school student. So the research is very, very well founded, thorough. I appreciate it. Once again, my name is Jerron Hawkins. I am a 2L at the Howard University School of Law, where I'm concentrating on education and youth justice policy. And with that being said, I want to pass it over to my colleague, Amaya Cook, and she'll get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again, Reverend Gilliard, for your insightful introduction, particularly your biblical sort of justifications for how incarceration is not justified by the gospel or by the Hebrew Bible. So a little bit about myself again. My name is Amaya Cook. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a first-year student at Harvard Divinity School, where I am focusing on the early Christian church and how it was a subversive group under the Roman Empire and how that applies to modern forms of liberation and justice and equity. So before we get started with our questions, we want to just first acknowledge that we're not going to get to everything that was discussed in the book, unfortunately. And we're not going to get to everything that has been discussed outside of the book regarding mass incarceration. This has been a topic that has been addressed for hundreds of years, and it's still not solved. And if it was solved, then we would not be having these discussions. But we hope that through this process and through this discussion, that people will get a better understanding of how the church has been a key player in sort of contributing to the rise of mass incarceration in the United States, and also how we as church people and also non-church people can enact restorative and transformative justice in society. So the first question was something you already hit on briefly, Reverend Gilliard, and the search for shalom and the search for wholeness and restoration of God's people and in society. So you say that those closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, and by amplifying the voices of those who are incarcerated, we get closer to sort of problem solving and truth seeking in the church. And so I'm thinking about this in terms of those so-called truth seekers that you mentioned a little bit in the second half of your book, particularly Protestant reformers who had these ideas about justice and liberation that were contrary to God's understanding of justice and liberation. And for example, you mentioned one Quaker church leader who believed that solitary confinement was beneficial to one's salvation and beneficial to one's communion with God. So I'm basically wondering, as people who have different understandings of shalom and different understandings of justice and liberation, how do we make sure to amplify those voices who are most impacted without distorting their voices and without distorting the true idea of shalom?
Yes, great question. I think for me, it really is in the power of proximity, and not only proximity, but also accountability. I think sometimes we can think about proximity as a checkbox, and we can say, oh, well, I did what scripture said. I went and visited prison, or I went and, I did that once a month, or once a year kind of thing. But I think there has to be some kind of accountability to the people whose voices you are representing. So I think about the same way that we think about allyship in regards to racial justice. We don't allow anybody who just puts a name badge that says ally to go out and represent us and think that they're going to faithfully do that without any kind of accountability. They're supposed to be proximate to us, in relationship with us, and kind of accountable to make sure that we sign off on kind of what they're going out and proclaiming and trying to champion in the world. And so I think the same kind of posture has to be at play here in this conversation. And I think, it's one of the ways in which I think we slowly but surely dehumanize incarcerated people in a way where we don't think we need to be accountable to them. Like, they should just be thankful that we're present with them and that we want to champion message. But accountability kind of isn't something that we take as seriously as we do in other relationships where there's the same kind of dynamic. And so I would just really emphasize proximity and accountability to a community that you're trying to represent.
Just for point of clarification, this is the point where the entire panel can engage in discussion, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'm gonna try to stay on topic, so bear with me. But in regards to the legal aspect, I first and foremost, just a brief disclaimer, I am Christian. I'm speaking from, my legal background and whatnot, so please do not take anything I say as to be like anti-Semitic in any way. But with that being said, I agree wholeheartedly that the people closest to the problem are, the people who are strongest to the solution. Now, a point that I brought up to Amaya and Joseph is that there is a difference in the type of power, presented between, the law and the church, or rather church and state. So in regards to the topic of the conversation, the Church of Shalom, how would you advise, or what is your advice to the church to, I guess, in also being close to the problem itself, being close to the power, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So how would you tell the church to balance that, like, be close to the problem, but you also need to be close to the power to fix the problem?
Yeah, so I would kind of first start off with the quote that I do in the book from Dr. King, where he says, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority." And I think Dr. King hit the nail on the head, because I think I'll speak specifically to the tradition I come from. In many ways, in regards to this conversation, the evangelical church has functioned as the state's tool in regards to its proclamation and endorsement of law and order. And a blind allegiance to law and order that doesn't allow us to actually really look critically at the statistics to show us that law and order doesn't mean what it sounds like on the surface. And it leads to over-policing in Black and brown and impoverished communities. It leads to the racial class disparities that are normative within our criminal justice system. And it leads to virtues and values that really are antithetical to the gospel of restoration and redemption for all people. And so I would say that we really have to think more critically about the ways in which we have functioned as the state's tool in that regard. But I think the other piece to what you're saying is that, and I think the answer is kind of, I'm gonna reverse it and play it backwards. So basically, through the evangelical churches, particularly the white evangelical churches, endorsement and kind of blind commitment to law and order, we've seen that it is a critically important political voting bloc. And so we see that politicians recognize the power of the church, but the church doesn't recognize the power that the church has. And so we're already kind of connected in the ways that we should be, but we aren't doing it with the kind of integrity and critical lens that will allow us to really be a part of actually breaking down a system that's infringing upon shalom for so many people. And so I don't think the access to power is the problem. I think we got enough access to power, but I think the problem is, what do we actually do with that? And are we willing to speak hard truths and represent a countercultural witness of belonging that actually might ruffle some feathers at certain tables of power, but actually will make us more effective and faithful witnesses to the gospel of Jesus Christ?
And Reverend Gilliard, reading the book, I always ask myself for issues such as this: is what is at stake? Who at the table of the issue and concern that we're facing is not present, and who voices is silent? So in terms of this shalom and restorative justice, when it comes down to Christianity, the Black church, and government, our legal professionals, who at the table would you consider has the power, or does not know their power, but is not using it for the wrong reasons, or is simply just not approaching and addressing the concern for what it is? Well, what is the confessions that these organizations have to confess in order to approach or strive to the shalom and restorative justice?
Yeah, so I would say I think the vast majority of us don't realize and recognize and use our power to the extent that we do. So one would assume that we're disproportionately talking about white churches. But one of the things I really appreciate about Michelle Alexander and her analysis is that she really critiques the Black church for its complicity with supporting the system and a kind of blind allegiance, because there are kind of the same motives are driving Black churches in regards to the fear mongering that's spewed. And so we need to understand that, like, mass incarceration is a bipartisan agenda. Both Republicans and Democrats use law and order rhetoric to further their careers and their political agenda. And it has led confessing Christians to actually be more fearful of the other than having this restored perspective that God can actually, to use the language of Brian Stevenson, transform Sauls to become Pauls today. We don't really believe that, and that lack of belief is evident in our civic engagement. And so what I would say is that yeah, we have to take seriously whose voices aren't represented and who doesn't have an advocate at the table. When we talk about particularly mental health, when we talk about physical disabilities, when we talk about our LGBTQ community, when we talk about different folks who are on the fringes and the margins of society, disproportionately, they lack the same kind of representation, particularly the poor. They lack the same kind of representation and advocate and champion at the table that's really going to uphold their interest in a way that their needs and their particular the particularity of their needs is really brought to the table. So a perfect example of this, just make it really practical, is when we talk about criminal justice reform. The fact that there are women in prison who, as part of what they receive as a basic necessity from the institution, is not menstrual pads and things to take care of them during that time of month, like that is crazy. And the fact that people have to use the meager funds that they get access to through the labor that's already economically exploiting them to provide something like that. And then we had a politician 2 years ago that said, well, why would we provide that? This isn't a country club. Like that kind of dehumanizing language and thought shows kind of what our brothers and sisters are being subjected to behind bars. And if the church isn't the advocate, isn't the voice of accountability, then who will be? And so that would be kind of how to answer that.
Who's next? Okay.
I just actually wanted to ask a follow-up question in regard to this concept of otherness that you mentioned. And you mentioned how, along with that, there are certain intersections that are involved regarding gender and sexuality, regarding race, regarding mental health elements. And I'm wondering just about the nuances of these intersections. So there's already this barrier of people not wanting to approach prisons because they think it's God's justifiable way of putting those who are sinners into these confined spaces. But along with that, we have these other topics of sort of queerness and transness that are unapproachable as well, that are even hard to deal with for some church people outside of prison. So how do we sort of dismantle those, both of those barriers, while being able to sort of humanize these folks in this dualistic way?
Yeah, rich question, deep question. So for me, I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to, are we able to affirm the image of God in all people? And if we are able to affirm the image of God in a person, regardless of how they identify or what their orientation might be, then we have to understand that we are inherently connected to that person as part of God's children, and that we have a right and a responsibility to really protect their dignity and their ability to, particularly in a carceral institution, to not be dehumanized and exploited and treated as less than a child of God. Like that's the basic foundation of what we're there to really be an advocate on behalf of the least of these, and to cultivate space where all people have authentic opportunities to encounter God. If we're thinking about just from a ministerial perspective, to encounter God, to kind of be restored and rehabilitated so that they can return to our communities and make our communities safer places, as opposed to places that are ultimately going to make, that really kind of reify the fear-based rhetoric that politicians like to use to keep us from desiring to be present behind bars with our brothers and sisters. So that's kind of the flat line of how I would respond to that question.
Okay, my question is sort of in the same ballpark, but speaking to the same issue, you may have the same answer, but as a law school student, I see it from as a law school student and as a Christian, it's like I can see the same issue from two different lenses. It's like, on one hand, if I was to face an LGBTQ issue, as a Christian, the Bible speaks out against homosexuality, but as a law school student, you know, especially as a social engineer at that, there's a person who belongs to a marginalized community who needs assistance. So for people who may be in the same boat, such as like, if I was to take it back to, you know, the civil rights era where we had Reverends Jesse Jackson, MLK, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was able to balance, you know, who was able to balance the insecurity within their religion with the need to help public people. How would you kind of push the church to make the same decision? Because I think that was one of the biggest advantages of the civil rights era, is that we had a lot of, you know, religious leaders leading that. And I think that in order for us to kind of see the same changes that happened then, whereas we had MLK meeting with LBJ, but we can't say that within the last, you know, 40 or 50 years. So to get back there, I think that there has to be a push for religious leaders to balance the, you know, a humane cause with also religious insecurity. So what is your take on that? Or like, am I making sense or articulating that right?
Yeah, I mean, so let's first dispel the notion that we ever got it completely right. The civil rights movement had flaws, it had issues. Women weren't empowered to lead and own their leadership. Bayard Rustin was marginalized because of his sexual identity. Like, so there were challenges even then. That said, I think when I think about the broader kind of social context we find ourselves in right now in regards to advocating for social change and systemic reform, I think you're right. The church has left a vacuum where there used to be people of faith who were out in leadership in more intentional ways than they are now. And a lot of the church is so interested in lobbying critique about the change, but if we're not going to actually put skin in the game, then I don't think we even have the integrity to critique. And so I think we have to really look at ourselves and turn the mirror inward and to say, why have we not been intentional as our history illustrates that we have been about actually being out in the streets, out in the midst of the movement, actually trying to cast vision and to demonstrate what it means to participate in the kingdom, as opposed to just you know, talking about it. And so I think in regards to the criminal justice system, I think I would say the same thing to a certain extent, but the reality is I also want to double up on this. There are a lot of ministers who are actually out there doing the work, who are actually leading, who are actually very present. They don't get the hero kind of spotlight that Dr. King did and that kind of thing. But I think it would be accurate. So, I mean, for a perfect example, Brian Stevenson is a Christian. Michelle Alexander is a Christian. I'm a Christian. I mean, there are a lot of people who are actually faithfully out there doing this work, and they might not lead explicitly with their faith in the same way that a Dr. King does, but their faith is what drives their activism. And I think sometimes that gets undermined because they're not preachers. But I think their witness is just as critical and is just as relevant. And I think it should convict more preachers and pastors to say, okay, if we already have people of faith who are leading the way, then I don't have to kind of feel hamstrung in the way that sometimes the church can get hamstrung when they say, oh, well, I don't know if I can get behind this because this isn't a Christian institution or a Christian organization, or yeah, which I think is a problem for another day. Y'all should have another conversation about that. But but I think it starts to illustrate that there is something about our faith in Christ that should compel us to go to places and spaces that other people aren't willing to go. And it should compel us to love in a sacrificial nature that is distinctive from what the rest of the world has. And so that's the thing I would really focus on, in the fact that at the gospel, it tells us that the world will come to know that we are Jesus's disciples by how we love one another. And I think there has to be something countercultural about how we love one another that bears witness to who and whose we are. And so that's how I would really try to challenge the church. Like, what is distinctive about our witness right now in regards to this conversation about criminal justice? Would our carceral institutions be any different if we weren't present here? Like, does our presence actually matter? Does it make a difference? Are we calling people into something, into a deeper kind of participation that leads to transformation? And if we're not, then we need to go back to the biblical text, because the text consistently calls us to that place and space. So that's how I would kind of try to respond to that.
Reverend Gilliard, as you continue to talk about this subject matter, I cannot not think about Brandon Bernard and Alfred, both victims of so many influences and categories of systematic oppression and the mass incarceration system that has lost their lives to this ideal and construct of the death penalty. How does religion or Christianity that proposes a pro-life theodicy or theology support this ceasing and automatic dehumanization and stripping of someone's humanity and a victim of the death penalty? How do we reconcile? How do we approach those sort of theologies that support the notion of pro-life, but still deem more than likely African-American, Latin-American community, or marginalized people to mass incarceration and the death penalty?
Yeah, so when we think about the death penalty, again, for me, it goes back to Romans, where it talks about kind of when God entered in on our behalf. It says, while we were sinners, while we were enemies of God. It didn't just say why we were apathetic towards God or why we didn't know God. It says why we were enemies of God. That's when God intervenes. But even more specifically to this conversation about death penalty, I talk about in the book, I go back to the person of Jesus Christ. When Jesus catches the woman caught in adultery and the law says that she requires to be stoned to death, Jesus inserts grace and mercy where the law requires bloodshed. Jesus had a chance to affirm the death penalty right in that moment in space, and he chooses not to. And he said, and Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And so people who want to point to the Old Testament law as like, that's why the death penalty is legitimate, if Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and gets the opportunity to affirm it and chooses to insert grace and mercy, then that is the quintessential answer for the body of Christ in regards to this question about the death penalty. And so that's, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Reverend Gilliard, for your poignant answer and your poignant answers that I'm sure have been festering in our minds and in the audience's mind. So with that, we are going to transition into some of the questions that were posed in the chat. If you have any questions that you would like answered, please put them in there and we will try to get back to them. So the first one we have is, how do believers outside of ministerial or law professions gain proximity?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do is to find the closest carceral institution to you and reach out to the chaplain there. And when you reach out to the chaplain, say, how can I or my community come alongside you to support you? We know the chaplains oftentimes are under-resourced and don't have the people power they need to effectively do the work they do for such a large institution. We would like to support, but not in a way that's going to be like we just come when we want to. We want to commit to be a faithful presence, to sit under your leadership for a while to see how we do it, and then ultimately to try to take some of this off your plate in accountability to you. Most chaplains will be ecstatic to have that kind of support from the community and people, and then also to find ways in which you can resource the institution. So one of the things that we do every year is we do a kind of Christmas drive to get new books inside of the institutions, because most people don't think about the fact that people inside institutions, many of them are voracious readers. They read any and everything they can get their hands on, but most of the books are like 30 years old and they don't have access to the latest and the best resources. And so that could be a tangible way that we can come alongside institutions to resource them and show them the love of God.
So along with supporting those who are incarcerated, how can we most be helpful to the families of incarcerated people?
Great question. So I say that all institutions or faith communities should be doing at least one of four things, but probably two of four things. We should be involved in the work of prevention that's coming alongside of people who we know who are more likely to end up behind bars. And so, for example, we know that children who have incarcerated parents are about 70% of them will end up in the criminal justice system at some point in their lifetime. We also know that kids in foster care have an escalated rate. We know all of these different things. And so like we can be involved in the preventative work, particularly latching to those people and actually trying to be a kind of mentoring presence in their life to try to help them to navigate all the pitfalls that are there for them. We can minister to the incarcerated, walk alongside of incarcerated people, walk alongside of families who have incarcerated loved ones who are trying to figure out how do they make ends meet now without mom, dad, brother, sister, breadwinners. How do we actually make it all come together? And then the last one is, and then the work of reentry. So those are the four ways. But when we think about how do we walk alongside of folks with incarcerated loved ones, there's a whole list of things I could recommend. One of which I'd say a lot of it is, spousal or parents. And a lot of times people have children and they want to visit their partner, but don't want their children to see their partner in that context. So think about providing childcare for people who want to go and visit their partner, but don't want their child to see their partner in that context. I think you could also think about, could you do fundraisers to help put money on the books for the incarcerated person, which will allow them to stay in constant contact with their loved one, because actually being in constant contact with a support system while you're incarcerated is one of the chief predictors of a person's ability to rehabilitate themselves. A lot of people are priced out of being in contact with their loved ones, though, because the charges for a phone call are so high. I think you could do, again, advocating. Another thing is that a lot of people have loved ones who are incarcerated across state lines, which makes it exceedingly difficult for them to be able to visit their loved one who is incarcerated. So again, trying to find out kind of the realities of the context of the person that you're trying to support will give you a whole laundry list of very tangible things that you can do. But in addition to this short answer, I actually have a PowerPoint that gives like a whole list of things, and I'll send it to the creator, the host, to be able to send out to people who attended.
Can I touch on this really quickly? Because this also hits home for me, being as though my mom has been locked up, my dad has been locked up, my stepdad has been locked up. Even 2 months ago, my younger brother just got released. And to your point about preventative measures, my younger brother is actually one of the reasons I've been in law school, because his sophomore year, I remember having to actually go back and forth for about a month to go to hearings and whatnot. So I was there when the judge hit the gavel and everything. But what was interesting is that he was initially incarcerated when he was 17. However, they pushed his trial date back until he turned 18 and then tried him as an adult. And I was like, that's a little funny. I don't know about that. So that literally drove me to go to law school, because I want to work to prevent measures like that. And then also from the perspective of a believer, another thing that happened to my younger brother while he was incarcerated, he actually denounced Christianity. And I think he aligns with something called 5%ers or whatnot. And one of his rationales for that was that my parents, who were Christians, weren't necessarily living up to the Christian faith as he thought they should have been. So it was kind of more so a hypocritical sense, whereas why would I do that when I'm in this current situation? I see you're not even doing to the best. So as believers, especially as it pertains to incarcerated families, I think to just really walk in the true light of God and how you're supposed to be living, because that is infectious. People see it, and we never would have guessed that. I remember one day I said, I'm gonna pray for you or something like that, and he messaged me back and was like, listen, I'm not a Christian anymore, I'm a 5%er. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't even mad at him, because I understood what he had seen from my parents. in order to like come to that, you know, conclusion and make those decisions. So just as believers, I can't stress this enough, but we need to believe, and, you know, everything that comes along with that. And then preventative measures are so important, because I at that moment, I had wished I was already a lawyer and I could do something about it. And I was like, I got another 6 years before I could do anything about it.
So real quick, I want to just chime on to that as well. So one of the other things that studies have revealed is that particularly adolescents and youth who are at risk to be incarcerated are more likely to do something to be incarcerated around the holiday seasons, because they come back to school and they hear all their friends talking about this great time they had with family and these gifts and being loved on, and these kids are frustrated because they don't have access to the same thing. So one of the things I really encourage churches to do, or institutions of faith to do, is around the holiday season, think about who in your life doesn't have a place to go, and how you can expand your dinner table to love on folk, to make them feel included, to be a part of community. And then the last other thing I wanted to say, you sparked something when you said something, is that, sorry, let me think. It left me, so sorry.
Was I talking about when they tried him as an adult after the fact, or what was it?
Yeah, I think it was just, you know, there's programs that try to make people feel included, like Prison Tree's Angel Tree program, but like those programs, while well-intended, they're not enough. Because if all you're doing is dropping off a gift for a child at Christmas in the name of their family and not doing anything with them for the next 11 months, we're missing opportunities to actually build relationships with people. And it's the relationships that actually stick. And so when we talk about, this was the thing I was going to say. We have to find ways within our institutions of faith to destigmatize this conversation. I can't tell you, every single time I go to a university, to a church, anywhere to preach, there's somebody who comes up to me afterwards and say, "Thank you so much for talking about this. This conversation is never talked about in this institution. And I have an incarcerated loved one, but nobody in the church knows. No one in my community knows," because people have so much shame with this conversation. And so we have to find ways to bring this into the light, because the reality is, statistics tell us that 48% of people in our nation have somebody close to them who's incarcerated. Like, so this is no longer people on the fringe. This is almost the majority of the country who have people, but we still operate as if there's this immense shame around it. And this is particularly true. And again, I appreciate this about Michelle Alexander. She calls out the Black church on this and says, well, we look at the numbers and we see how prevalent incarceration is in our community. Why are we still acting like this is this taboo issue? And until we start to put it into the light and help people to understand that, like, there is not shame about having somebody who is incarcerated who is connected to you, and that you don't have to bear this burden alone, but you have a community who wants to walk alongside of you, who wants to support you, who wants to be there with you in the midst of what you're enduring. Like, that's the big shift that I think that the church or institutions of faith have to make.
What sparked for me in Mr. Hawkins' testimony and his sharing of his personal connections to the issue, and then your response, Reverend Gilliard, is the pivotal groundbreaking, the shaking that this book and so many others around this issue has against the resistance on notions and theology that is oppressive, and also that demonizes those that are impacted by the mass incarceration system. How does the Black church, how does the church in general become a resistance or reforms itself from oppressive theologies and theodicy that supports this demonization of those that are impacted by the mass incarceration system?
Well, I'll just say part of it, I think, is internalized racism. And we do so much to make sure that we're not the statistic, that I think we end up slowly but surely distancing ourselves from people who we think are the statistics or represent the statistics, so that we can be more acceptable in other places in space and be known as not that Black person. And so I think we have to do some real internal work around the way systems of white supremacy and kind of colonial power have caused us to want to distance ourselves from our own people. I think we also have to have real conversations about the same fear that drives so many other people towards anti-Blackness are things that are operative within our own community. And until we name that and actually start to put some of that on the table and deconstruct it, then we're going to continue to be really arrested by it. And so I think we have to have some real conversations about the ways in which we have internalized messaging that has really distorted our witness and prohibited us from actually truly walking alongside of our brothers and sisters who are caught up in the system.
Thank you, Reverend Gilliard, and sharing your responses to how we might dismantle shame and how we might dismantle anti-Blackness that is so rooted in mass incarceration. And I think that answers one of the questions in the chat and what we can do beyond just prayer and what we can do just beyond our belief that actually leads to tangible change in regard to restorative and transformative justice. So I'm going to tie two of these questions together in the chat that talk about what we can do as an alternative to incarceration. So is there some sort of revolutionary, radical alternative to jails or another system that does not incarcerate people? And along with that, is there an incremental legislative reform that can get us to restorative justice? Or does this require a more disruptive revolution in public will and civil disobedience?
Yeah, so our criminal justice system will not be fixed by little tweaks and tinkers. There is a foundational problem. One of the things I didn't get to talk about earlier is the fact that, you know, one of the biggest fallacies around mass incarceration is that most people think that it's a byproduct of the war on drugs and that it really launches in 1971. Well, mass incarceration really launches in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction and slavery, the emergence of what's known as slavery by another name because of the loophole that exists in the 13th Amendment, where Black people were being arrested in mass because of Black codes, which were literally laws that were taken from slave codes and reinterpreted so they could be reapplied after slavery was abolished. And so this notion that mass incarceration and the racial disparities that exist within our system are kind of something that emerged in 1971 is fallacious, and it really is something that keeps us from getting down to the roots of the problem. But I think within the conversation about what's needed, I mean, I think there are strategic policy changes and reforms that we have to pursue now that feel radical for some people, that will move us closer towards a system that is truly rehabilitative. Some of those things are, you know, ending cash bail, which some people have real angst about, but there's actually, it's been implemented in states and there's been a success rate that should ease some of that angst. I think there are very tangible things around things like decriminalizing marijuana use, and in states that have already made marijuana legal, people who are incarcerated still for marijuana offenses should be released immediately. How can you be making buku money off of the legalization of marijuana and there's still people who are in your state who are arrested for marijuana offenses? They're just like very common sense reforms like that should be happening immediately. I think things like trying juveniles as an adult is ludicrous. If you have a mandatory age for a person being able to join the military, why wouldn't you have a minimum age for a person to be able to be tried as an adult? So there's like very tangible reforms, but I think there are some bigger things needed. I know a lot of people are scared off by language of defund the police, but if we actually look at what is actually being called through these movements, we're saying, let's be honest and sober about the fact that our present response system is not working. So why do we continue to deploy police to situations where police aren't the best trained people to be deployed to be conflict de-escalators? There are people who have particular training in reducing in conflict de-escalation with people with mental health impairments, or people who are on substance abuse, or all these different categories that exist. And law enforcement has proven that it's not the best option. So we need to start to reallocate some of those funds to other institutions or vocations that are more properly trained to go into that position and to de-escalate the conflict. The other way, I'll think about this real quick and I'll land here, is that there was this really critical study that was done in my city, Chicago, called $1 Million Blocks. I highly recommend everybody go look up this study. It was a study called $1 Million Blocks, and they wanted to know how many single city blocks within the city of Chicago had more than $1 million of investment in incarcerating citizens from that single city block. Chicago has is $851 million blocks. And they're all on the south and the west side of the city where Black and brown people live. There's not $1 million block in the city core or on the north side of the city, but they're all in communities where Black and brown communities are. And they started, within their analysis of $1 million blocks, they said that there were 3 real core identifiers for $1 million blocks. And $1 million blocks were communities that had high rates of home foreclosures, high rates of school closures, and low vocational opportunities. So again, we're talking about the least of these. And they said if you did the analysis in another way and did something that's akin to defund the police, but look at reallocating funds, they said if you just took 10% of the money that we were using to sustain the status quo of investing over $1 million in a single city block to incarcerate people, that would free up $480,000 that we could reinvest towards the flourishing of that community, as opposed to keeping the community locked in the status quo. And so we need creative initiatives and strategies like that that are going to move us beyond this gridlock that we're in, because we've been here too long, and this tinkering around the edges isn't going to get it done. We're going to have something bold and innovative and use some new wineskins, to use some religious language, to help us to envision what we could how we could truly pursue shalom.
Well, thank you so much again for your answers. And particularly thank you for putting this issue into current context, and sort of thinking about how these ideas are deemed as radical because the church cannot accept the reality of mass incarceration being a pervasive issue in the United States.
Thank you so much for coming. We are sure that you've had some thought-provoking discussion, but we don't want your engagement to end with this issue, to stop here. We're praying that you continue to investigate and converse, pray, and find new insights as we seek God's vision of shalom.